Hi, my name is Jason. I also go by the artist name of Fake Zappa, and I do activism when it comes to what I consider to be harmful forms of what people call mental health. And today I want to talk about the good old days. What was mental health like when I started out in it? Now, when I started out having any kind of influence with mental health, it was with stuff that wasn't really considered in what I don't like to call it this way, but the mainstream mental health or conventional mental health practices, which is typically consist of psychotherapy, medication, sometimes group therapy, sometimes other stuff, or electroshock therapy, whatever it is. And so I was sent out to a very expensive place out of state, and it was a very new agey type thing. And so as we all know, those can be harmful just because, new ideas aren't bad. They just haven't had a lot of time to test them. And they had some ideologies that had a lot of hocus pocus with it, but nothing compared to the conversion therapy experiences that I went through with a Bible ideology and with trying to get me to change my orientation and things like that, which is very psychologically harmful and very traumatic. However, there were times when I did have mental health practices that were very effective. And if somebody is suffering and they might not necessarily be suicidal, then if they don't get some kind of treatment, they could very well be suicidal. And being suicidal isn't at all a character issue. It's not something that somebody can change. It is typically brain chemistry. A lot of times it is situational. A lot of times it does happen to do with a mixture of the both, or sometimes it's just simply the brain just misfiring and saying, I have to harm myself in order to cope, or I want out of this reality or this world. I can't cope with it, and therefore I'm either going to end my life or do something in that direction that might not necessarily end my life, but maybe shorten it. And so suicidal folks eventually lose control. They don't want to harm themselves. They don't want to take their own life. They lose control of their will, and that's where things get really difficult, because you have some moral type of dilemmas about, do we violate the person's will? Empowerment is very important for people that are in crisis, and sometimes the first thing people want to do is take away their power instead of empowering them to make the decisions they want to make, which is really, hey, I really want to get better. That's what most people want to do. That is their core belief. What's going on in their head is something totally different. Now, what about the good old days? This was when I was 20 years old, and I was leaving the community that I felt like an outcast. And it was funny because here I am, this total artsy-fartsy hippie dude in a community of, early 90s dreadlocks, didgeridoos, and djembes, and the Baja things, which is this this thing that looked like it was from Central America, and it had this big pocket where you put your hands in, and they were so tacky, but I loved them. And I had a mullet. It was even worse than this thing that I have right now. And I still did not find any recognition in that community, no matter what I had to contribute. And I was also suffering to the point when there was no way I could have any kind of success, which means getting some kind of following. And back then it wasn't a numbers game like it is today on social media and stuff like that. So back in 92 and 93, when I really started losing my mind in my late teens, it was terrifying. And I wasn't very lucid, and I was going through a lot of psychosis and things like that. So when I left Oregon and I went to Alaska, things definitely got worse. I was in a real hocus pocus world, so to speak. And there was a lot of belief systems that I had. There was a lot of people I was hanging out with in the metaphysical community. And it was very harmful, I would say. There was a different amount of harm going from that to the biblical paradigm, which is what I switched to when I was 20 years old. And as a result of that, I started manifesting even more symptoms and I did find a good supportive community though, but at that point I didn't really have a community. And so I was in a sort of transitional living program because I was homeless. And so I called a mental health helpline. Now here's the thing. One phone number, one call, and guess what happened? They actually sent a vehicle. It was funny. They actually sent a taxi. They paid for a taxi to pick me up. I wasn't even suicidal. I was under a lot of distress. And they took me right to, not a lockdown facility because I wasn't suicidal. I did not need that level of care. It was called a crisis respite center across town. And they gave me 3 hot meals a day. In fact, I was somewhere a little over 150 pounds, maybe 160 at that time. I was skin and bones at 6'2". And so they gave me double portions, which I thought was funny. And I walked around with these pajamas from the Alaska Psychiatric Institute, which was just next door. So the big psych ward, the big psych hospital was on the same campus. And then they had another place which was called South Central Counseling, which was their, now get this, follow-up place where they send you to get additional counseling and medication management and social work. Now that sounds like I'm overreacting to how amazing that is, but that's the way things should be. And that's a state that had a lot of funding in a period of time where the mental health industry wasn't so flooded like it is now. And it was amazing how effective it was. And I long to see that happen again. And I'm looking at the mental health system the way it is now. And I call myself a conservative sympathizer. So whenever I hear conservatives talking about gun control and the failed mental health system, I'm like, well, you know, I'm a liberal. And of course, I don't agree with most of these views. But then again, if there's anybody who has ever seen the mental health system fail, it would be people like me who had fallen through the cracks. I'm not quite severe enough to get help, or I'm too severe to get help in certain places. And I get in this zone where I can't get help at all, especially with the kind of insurance I have these days. But back then I had no insurance. I had no income. And it's funny how much help you can get if you have nothing. I didn't have a home. I didn't have a community. Now, today it's not the case though, but there are some doors that can open for you if you have nothing. But today you have to be covered with blood and you have to have meth in your urine for them to really take you seriously, unfortunately. So, the good old days, what happened? Yeah, I spent, I think it was anywhere between 7 to 10 days at my first hospitalization at the Crisis Respite Center. They put me right into follow-up. I went back into the transitional living program that I was in. And I wasn't really taking it seriously then too, because I was still having a lot of kind of young person hocus pocus sort of I'm going to be cured sort of attitude, which a lot of people have. And it's not just because somebody is young and hopeful and impressionable. It's because I was in communities, especially spiritual communities, can be wonderful and also horrible because they can give us a place where we can be encouraged and empowered and all that good stuff. But they also give us this viewpoint that everybody there's trying to cure us. And they're trying to get us to cope based on if we were high functioning. And that's what I see with pretty much, I guess, every community I've ever been to that claims any kind of spiritual or religious stuff. Although I'm not opposed to any of that stuff, I'm opposed to a hocus pocus mentality of snap out of it, you're cured, follow these things, say these prayers, whatever, and you're cured and you don't need conventional mental health care. So I also believe that aside from conventional mental health care, adding to that, now not making your spiritual stuff the priority or the high point or whatever it is of your care, spirituality is a very important thing, is a supplemental thing. But I don't think it should take over your care. And that's a huge thing that I see when it comes to fake mental health, harmful mental health. But that's another subject right now. I'm talking about the good old days, the way things were and how awesome it was. I went into that crisis respite program 3 times within a year period. I was in and out. And I was able to, within, let's see, about a year or so, I was working full-time jobs, and then I started a business by the age of 21. I was making good money, doing what I love. I was teaching music, working at a music store, and I have the mental health community to thank for that. I also have the spiritual community. These were Bible-based churches that I got a hold of, and it was great to kind of rid myself from all the weird shit that I got in the New Agey community and growing up in that, and all the confusing stuff. And then from my perspective, though, when I came out of the biblical world, then I had to detox from all of that again. So I like talking about spirituality because there's not a lot of people, especially when it comes to politics, because when you cross that line of a strict biblical paradigm shift, or you go away from that, you have to reconstruct your reality, and you have to reconstruct your world. And for some people, they just simply can't do it. They try to coexist in these two things, or they just get confused or whatever. They don't challenge everything when they make that shift. But having been introduced to the Bible world and then reintroduced to a sort of non-Bible world has been a really rewarding experience for me, and being able to talk about it a lot as well. So another place I went to get mental health services was Kentucky, and they weren't very good, especially the psych ward. It was horrible. They were abusive, and it was just kind of like the typical stories that you hear, horror stories about being in a psych ward, being threatened to be put in restraints and all that stuff. And, luckily they let me go after like 3 or 4 nights. And my partner at the time was so happy because he was so worried about it. And when I got out of there, that is what accelerated my ability to get in and get med management psychotherapy. There were a lot of nonprofit groups that had support groups, so I was able to get into those anytime, anywhere, really. But when it comes to group therapy, usually there's a waiting list for that too, because there's a difference between support groups and group therapy. Group therapy is more of a clinical thing taught by and facilitated by somebody who's either studying to do this or has studied to do this. And they're typically a little better than support groups, although support groups are peer run. And so a peer is somebody who also lives with a mental illness and might have a little bit of more recovery under their belt. I mean recovery, not necessarily dual diagnosis, not necessarily drug and alcohol. I mean just a mental health recovery, recovering from a breakdown, a hospitalization, or whatever that is. And so Kentucky was an interesting experience because men don't get mental health services in Kentucky like they do in other places that I've lived. The suicide rate is really sad, especially from baby boomers and even my generation too. And there's also a thing too, is that if somebody can't function and they can't work, there's stronger families there too, as opposed to living in urban coastal areas like I've had most of my life. And so you just don't see much of a need or much of a drive to go get mental health services. But there still was a 6-month waiting list to get in. Now, here's the sad part, is that they would only let me in the hospital if I was making plans to harm myself or somebody else or kill myself or whatever. And I really didn't. I was really suffering, and I felt like I was on my way to do that if I hadn't gotten help immediately. And I was experiencing some recent trauma. And that's when I came out of the whole straight camp experience, the whole conversion therapy thing. Nobody knew what to do with me. I was out of control, and I needed help. And I had some family help that really pushed me over the edge and made me to where I really have to get help. And if the only way to get help is to tell them I'm suicidal and planning to do this, then I'm going to have to lie about it. And I hate that. It's the only time that I remember lying to a mental health provider. And I don't want to do it again. I don't lie to them about smoking weed. I don't lie to them about not being suicidal, but needing help immediately and watching them cringe and freak out and do nothing. And so Kentucky, what happened, I got out of the hospital. I was able to get on medication starting from there. And a side note, I just remembered this the other day too. There was the psychiatrist there didn't seem to want to put me on medications. And this is one of the biggest assholes in mental health that I've ever met. His answer for me was just get a job. You know, and here it was, I was working in factories and warehouses. I was getting pieces of scrap metal, little pieces of scrap metal stuck in my hands and stuff. And here I am, you know, having a professional background as an artist, musician, and a producer. And I was trying to survive in a place with no car, and I was experiencing complete burnout. I just was ceasing to function. And so what happened with that was I was able to, now, I didn't take his advice. I did try to get a job later that year, and, you know, I last a matter of days or weeks, and I freak out and I can't do it. And I had to recover, and that's sad. And I got on disability. But that was instrumental in getting me on disability, medication, and consistent, conventional mental health care. And so that whole experience was way better than anything I experienced here in the Willamette Valley in the state of Oregon and the Portland metropolitan area. The absolute worst. Now, compared to the good old days, Portland is absurd for a lot of reasons. Not because it's useless and people are making a lot of money doing a lot of nothing and a lot of harm to a lot of people, but we attract a couple of interesting demographics. One of them is the homeless, moderate climate, and a lot of very generous, hyper-polite people. And of course, bleeding heart liberals. And we do have some churches too, but it's mostly just people that are a little more generous to homeless people and less hostile than other places. And then the other thing is what they call creatives, and creatives like hyper fucking creative people that are just so out there accessing the creative realms and doing these things and just sort of on the street and sort of in this sort of dissociative state. There's a lot of people like that, especially a lot of homeless people that are really creative, and especially the unrecognized ones as well. And there's a lot of people in the Portland metropolitan area that fit that kind of personality type. And they're drawn here as well from other places because of the colleges and the culture and all this kind of stuff too. And the opportunities as well. A lot of people buy and sell art here. And it's pretty good. It used to be a lot better. There's a lot of shitty art and a lot of art that has become overly popular thanks to social media. And so anyways, that's what makes where I'm living right now in this day and age. Now, location is one thing, and having these demographics is another thing. But the time that we're living in, what's happening is that with people and especially organizations, the organizations that are powerful are getting more powerful, and the smaller organizations, especially nonprofits here with the new administration, people were scared a couple of years ago. They stopped giving. They were suffering, closing their doors, things like that. Nonprofits are doing the work of a provider even though they really can't. They're not supposed to, and most of them aren't set up to do that at all. And so there's a thrust towards peer-to-peer type providing. The Warm Line is a good example. And peer support specialists and things like that are being hired to different providers to provide, sort of a moderate level of care, but for people that have been there. And so that's a great thing to have. So I'm comparing what it's like 25, 26, 27 years ago as compared to now. It is a corporate for-profit monster that we are dealing with. And they put a ton of regulations on there to make it really hard for people to get the kind of care they need because they have to follow all this bullshit. And a lot of it's good to help people get safe, but they got their priorities out of whack. And so another thing too is it's very underfunded, and they're getting a lot of government money. And a lot of it's going towards not necessarily the care of people, but it's going somewhere. And so we're getting executives from even nonprofit healthcare that are getting way too much money. It's way too centralized, and it's like this amoeba that keeps growing, these big healthcare organizations, and of course there's the drug industry that has a huge role in all this stuff, and they're funding nonprofits and they're influencing nonprofits, and it's just a big fucking mess. But as a result, what we're getting is we're getting more self-harm, more drug addiction, more suicide, more homelessness, and basically just more being really fucked up. And that's a result of what's happening as compared to what I experienced in the good old days of mental health. Compared to now, it's absurd. It is night and day, and it's just something I have to talk about. So I thank you for listening, and I hope that helps folks as far as like regionally where we are today and what kinds of people we're dealing with, and maybe changes that we can make.